Okay, third grade, this is the Sisters Grimm, Part 5. Relda, I believe there's a law in this town about keeping animals on a leash, Charming said. The men stared at each other for a long moment, and then suddenly, Candace's eyes changed back to watery gray. The old man looked exhausted, and his face grew pale. That's quite enough of this nonsense, Granny said, stepping in between the two men. Every time Charming and Candace were in a room together, they were at each other's throats. But the old woman had a way of making them feel foolish. They stepped back and lowered their eyes like two squabbling schoolboys who had just been disciplined. It's time to go. The family exited the school and found their ancient black jalopy in the parking lot. The beat-up monstrosity was in desperate need of a tune-up, and its long-neglected shocks groaned and complained as each person climbed inside. Elvis was in the back, snuggling under a huge blanket, and didn't even bother to lift his head when the girls got in. Dolphine wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and gave him a big, wet smooch on the forehead. "We missed you today," she announced. Elvis tucked his head under his blanket and hid. "What's the matter with him?" the little girl said. "He's pouting. He doesn't like to be left in the car," Granny said, as she jotted something in her notebook. "Aw, my little baby," Dolphine said, trying to pull the 200-pound dog onto her lap like an infant. She showered the Great Dane in kisses. "Is somebody sad? Did somebody get left in the car? I won't ever leave you in the car." Elvis gave her a lick on the cheek and the girl giggled. Granny spun around in her seats with a delighted look on her face. "You know what all this means?" Sabrina groaned. "We're in the middle of a mystery." "Isn't it exciting?" the old woman cried. "Yes, and pointless," the girl argued. "You heard Charming in his ridiculous spider theory. He knows the Scarlet Hand killed Mr. Grumpner, but instead he lies about it. Grumpner was a human, so Charming couldn't care less. Why should the ever-after mayor and the ever-after police department do anything at all? No, they'll just cover up his death, and we'll run into one dead end after another." "We are Grimms, and this is what we do," Dolphine said. "Exactly right, little one. We are Grimms. And part of what we do is to make sure this kind of thing doesn't go unpunished. We'll just sit here until everyone is gone, and then we'll go back inside and have a look ourselves," the old woman said. "I have a feeling there are a lot more clues in that room." Suddenly, Mr. Seven was tapping on the window of the car. He motioned for Granny to roll it down and looked around nervously. "Good evening, Mr. Sevens. Mayor Charming is requesting your presence at the mansion." "You mean Billy?" Granny said, turning in her seat to wink at the girls. The dwarf chuckled. "He has something he wishes to discuss in private." Granny and Mr. Candace shared a suspicious glance. After a moment, Mr. Candace nodded his approval. "Tell him Mr. Charming will be there," the old woman said. The dwarf nodded and walked over to the mayor's long white limousine. He buffed the silver stallion on the hood with his shirt sleeve, then climbed onto the stack of phone books on the driver's seat. Soon the limo was pulling away. "Are you sure you're feeling up to this?" Granny said, putting her hand on the old man's shoulder. Mr. Candace nodded. He started the car, and it sputtered to life with a series of backfires that Sabrina was sure could be heard in the next town. They followed Charming's limo through the quiet country roads of Fairy Point Landing. Sabrina gazed out at the sleepy little river town that her great-great-great-great-grandfather, Wilhelm Grimm, had founded. Anyone driving through it would think it was just another boring little town. They would never know that many of the residents were princes, pigs, witches, and fairies, all in disguise. And on the rare occasion when one of the really big ever-afters caused trouble, such as one of the giants or dragons, The endless acres of firs, Chinese maples, and oak trees that surrounded the town acted as an excellent cover from prying eyes. In addition, the invisible magical barrier that Wilhelm and the witch Baba Yaga had constructed around Fairy Point Landing meant no ever after, no matter how big, could leave the area. As for the humans who lived in town, they were none the wiser. The ever afters were too good at covering up their magic and mischief. Sabrina often wished she were oblivious too. Fairy Point Landing was a perfect place to live, unless you knew that it was all a lie, and that the lie kept Sabrina from getting comfortable in her new life. As they pulled into Charming's sprawling estate, Sabrina realized the mayor was the only person in town she could trust. He was corrupt, but at least he was upfront about it. He planned to buy the town piece by piece and recreate the kingdom he had given up when the ever-afters came to America. He didn't care if you liked it or not, and he didn't care if you thought it was wrong. Charming could always be counted on to do what was right for himself. He might not have any morals, but at least he was consistent. Mr. Candace parked the car and turned off the engine. The last time Sabrina had been in the mansion, it had been all lit up like a Christmas tree for the Fairy Point Landing Ball, an annual event for which the ever-after community came together to be themselves and to celebrate. Without all the glitz and glamour, Charming's mansion looked vacant. The lights were off. The fountain, which featured a lifelike sculpture of Charming, was drained and full of dead leaves. Mrs. Grimm, if it's okay with you, I believe I will stay here, Mr. Candace said as he opened the door for Granny. I'm feeling a bit tired, and I suspect Charming will only make it worse. Of course, Mr. Candace, Granny said. I don't believe Mayor Channing poses any threat to us. Elvis whined when he saw that the family was leaving him in the car. Elvis, we're not leaving you in the car. We're putting you in charge of it, Dolphine said. The dog lifted his huge ears as if he was listening very carefully. It's a really important job. You have to stay and guard Mr. Candace. Don't let anything bad happen to him. Elvis barked, confirming his orders. He sat up in the back seat and watched out the windows for any would-be attackers. As the Grimms approached the mansion, Sabrina looked back and noticed Candace doing something very odd. The stick-thin man had climbed on top of the car and sat Indian-style on the roof. He closed his eyes and rested his hands on his knees. What's he doing? Sabrina asked. Meditative yoga, Granny replied, as if it was a natural response. It's helping him remain centered and calm. Keeps the dark stuff at bay. Of course, the big bad wolf does yoga, Sabrina thought. Why did I even bother to ask? The trio stood on the front steps of the mansion, and before Granny could ring the bell, Mr. Seven opened the door and ushered the family inside. Good evening, he said. Without offering to take their coats, he turned and raced up the staircase. I'll get the mayor for you. What do you think he wants? Delphine wondered. Hard to say, Granny said. The mayor is full of surprises. Maybe he felt like he didn't get to insult us enough at the school, Sabrina muttered, just as Charming appeared at the top of the stairs. Sabrina watched him grimace, then take a deep breath as he came down to join them. This conversation must be absolutely secret, he said as he stood before them. He leaned down and pinned a shiny tin star on Sabrina's coat. It looked like the kind sheriffs wore in old black and white westerns. He peered down at it and read the words, Fairy Point Landing, Special Forces Deputy Officer. What's this? She asked Charming, as Charming pinned a similar star on Dolphine's coat. The little girl looked at it and smiled. "Look at me, I'm a cowboy." "May I?" Charming said to Granny. The old woman hesitated, but finally agreed, and he pinned the star on her dress too. "I don't think I understand what's taking place, Mayor Charming," Granny said. "I'm deputizing you," he said uncomfortably. "Raise your right hand and repeat after me." Charming raised his right hand and waited for the Grimms to do the same. Sabrina stared blankly at the man, wondering if maybe he was pulling some kind of prank on them. "Don't make this harder on me than it has to be," he begged. "The town needs your help. You know it and I know it. Can't that be enough?" "You want our help?" Sabrina said. I know you've been helping Hampstead," the mayor said, "and for some reason the sheriff thinks you will be able to help with this case." "Mayor Charming," Granny exclaimed, "I never thought I'd see the day when you would come to this family for anything." The man lowered his right hand and groaned. "Do you think I would have asked you if it wasn't absolutely necessary? I swore I'd see your family rot before I asked for your help. But drastic times call for drastic measures." "What are you talking about?" Sabrina demanded impatiently. But as she waited for the mayor to answer, she noticed something odd about the mansion. It was filthy. Several curtains in the ballroom had fallen down and lay in heaps on the floor. A giant red stain had ruined a polar bear rug lying near the fireplace. The carpet on the stairs needed a good vacuuming, and a bucket sat on the floor collecting rain from a giant patched-up hole in the ceiling. Half a dozen overflowing bags of garbage sat by the door waiting to be taken out, and a thick layer of dust covered everything, including a full set of armor that leaned precariously against the wall. "What happened here?" she said. "You happened here," Charming snapped. "You and your smelly sister ruined the only fundraising event this town has each year." Delphine raised an arm to smell her armpit. She crinkled her nose and lowered her arm quickly. "I'm not that bad," she said. "You crashed an invitation-only party, brought a giant here, which nearly destroyed the mansion and several cars in the parking lot, and worst of all, you made me look like a fool in front of the town's biggest donors," the mayor said. "We didn't raise a penny. The town is broke." "We know what the fundraiser is really for," Sabrina said. "You wanted to use the money to buy the whole town. Why don't you just dip into the money you've conned everybody out of for the last 200 years? "You dare question my honor?" Charming growled. "I haven't taken a penny out of this town. The rumor about my finances are greatly exaggerated. Relda, do you believe I would live like this if I didn't have to?" Granny gazed around the room. "No, I don't," she said. "Services have been cut drastically. Transportation, education. I even had to fire the crew of workers who polished statues of me in the park. Mr. Seven has agreed to a substantial pay cut, and I haven't taken a salary in weeks. I had to lay off 3/4 of the town's police force, which, since there were only 4 police officers to begin with, leaves me with Hampstead. The sheriff works hard, and he's smart as a whip, but he's only one pig. We're stretched too thin, and we just don't have the resources to investigate a crime, let alone a murder committed by the Scarlet Hand. I need your help, and since most of this is your family's fault, I think it's your responsibility." "So now the Scarlet Hand exists, huh?" "Why did you lie about it back at the school?" Sabrina asked. "Because I don't need the citizens of this town to panic. If word got out that there was a terrorist group killing people, there would be chaos in the streets. Hampstead can barely keep up now with the speeding tickets and jaywalkers. Your family has proven to be good detectives. You're persistent and lucky and stubborn," Charming continued. "If you don't stop whatever did that to the teacher, then it won't get stopped." "Why do you care what happened to a human teacher?" Sabrina said. "I thought you hated humans." Charming said nothing. "You don't want anything bad to happen to Miss White," Delphine cried. "You're in love with her. You want to kiss her and hug her. Nonsense, the mayor shouted. I can't have terrorists running around the elementary school, even if I approve of who they're killing. You want to write her love notes, the little girl persisted. You want to hold her hand in the park and look at puppies in the pet store. Is there an off button for that one? Charming asked. The old woman grinned at the mayor. You haven't answered the questions. All right, Charming surrendered. Snow has a knack for getting in trouble. I would sleep better at night knowing she's safe. Of course we'll do what we can, Granny said. What are you going to do for us? Sabrina asked. The old woman looked at her in horror. We would never take payment for helping folks. Granny, finding the killer is going to take a lot of time. Time that we could use to find Mom and Dad, Sabrina argued. What can I do? Charming said. I can't exactly send Hampstead to search everyone's homes. No, but you have connections we don't, Sabrina said. People will talk to you. Maybe there's something we could use. Something magical lying around we don't know anything about. Use your imagination, Billy. Charming thought for a moment. You have my word. He raised his right hand. It'll have to do, Sabrina said as she raised her hand as well. Granny and Delphine did the same. I do solemnly swear to protect and serve the inhabitants of... What does inhabitants mean? Delphine interrupted. It means the people who live in a particular place, her sister answered, noting Charming's impatient face. Why didn't you just say the people then? The little girl asked. Let him finish, Granny said. I do solemnly swear, Charming started over, to protect and serve the people of Fairy Point Landing to the best of my ability. I vow to protect the peace, secure the safety, and uphold the rule of law. Grimms repeated what he said word for word and then lowered their hand. You are now officially deputized under the laws of Fairy Point Landing, the mayor said, as he pulled out a set of keys and handed them to Granny. What are these? Granny said, looking down at the key ring. Keys to the school, Charming said. You'll need them to get inside. Granny smiled and handed the keys back to the mayor. I have my own set, thank you, she said. Charming scowled and shoved the keys back in his pocket. Well, I love to keep this happy event going all night, but as you know, I can't stand you people, he said, leading them to the door. As his hand clutched the knob, he turned and looked at the girls in their eyes. Snow is important to me. I would appreciate you keeping a close eye on her. No problem, Billy, Delphine replied, wrapping her arms around the mayor and hugging him tightly. It's so romantic. Charming sneered, opened the door, and forcefully shoved the family outside. You should really tell her that you love her, Delphine said right before the mayor slammed the door in her face. Sabrina had been to a lot of schools in the last year and a half, and they all had a few things in common. Every one of them had a couple grouchy teachers, a bully's punching bag, a weird cafeteria lady, a bathroom that everyone was afraid to go into, and a librarian who worshipped something called the Dewey Decimal System. None of those schools, however, had a teacher-killing monster scurrying through its hallways. And they say New York City had everything? Granny was convinced that a monster, maybe working with Scarlet Hand, had killed Mr. Grumpner. Not knowing exactly what the monster looked like or where it might be now was doing a number on Sabrina's nerves as her grandmother led the girls through the darkened hallways of the school. The long shadows cast by the setting sun looked like dinosaurs and invading aliens. Every little creak sounded like the tread of Bigfoot or a swamp monster. And worse, Grumpner's bloodless purple face appeared every time Sabrina closed her eyes. All she wanted to do was run back to the car and hide under Elvis's blanket, but Granny insisted they take another look at the crime scene. For once, the girl wished Mr. Canis was by their side, but the skinny old man had chosen to stay in the car and meditate in the freezing cold. Luckily, Granny had relented to Elvis's begging, and the big dog trotted down the hall beside them. Mr. Canis looks terrible, and for him that's particularly bad, Sabrina said to the old woman as they crept along. In the past, he's been able to tap into the wolf's strengths without losing himself, her grandmother explained, but this time he made a complete transformation, and worse, he tasted human blood. It's been a long time since that has happened, and the wolf is not going to be put away without a fight. Don't worry, children. Mr. Canis will win the battle. And if he doesn't, Sabrina says, he will. I'm sure he'll be happy that you're concerned for his well-being. I'm more concerned about waking up in his belly, Sabrina thought. When they got to Sabrina's homeroom, the crime scene tape and Grumpner's body were already gone. The broken window had been replaced, and all the cobwebs were cleared. Even the blood-red handprint on the chalkboard was gone. Other than some misplaced desk, there was no evidence of a gruesome scene they had witnessed only hours before. Principal Hamlin had obviously cleaned the place up. Whatever it was didn't catch him by surprise, Granny said, pushing a desk back into its row. The way these desks are scattered, it looked like Mr. Grumpner tried to fight back. Sabrina shuddered as she imagined her teacher fighting off his attacker. Whether it was a giant spider or 1,000 little ones, the fact that the man's death had been a nightmare for him. Even a grouch like Grumpner doesn't deserve to die so horribly. Why are we here now? Delphine asked as they walked into the classroom. We'll never find anything in the dark. Some of the best clues are found in the dark, Granny said. She crossed the room and opened Grumpner's desk drawers. They were empty except for the bottom one. Inside was a picture of the teacher and a woman. They were on a pontoon boat enjoying an afternoon on the Hudson River. Grumpner and the woman each had a glass of champagne in their hands and were toasting each other. His wife, Sabrina asked, as Granny showed her the picture. I can't imagine that Mr. Cranky found anyone to marry him. He was probably a very different person at home, the old woman replied. You told me once you thought your father was too careful, but the Henry Grimm I know threw caution to the wind. There are many sides to all of us. His wife must be very sad, Delphine sighed. Granny sighed too. I suppose she is. Well, we found a picture, Sabrina said, eyeballing a shadow in the corner that looked like a boogeyman. Can we go now? This place is giving me the willies. Don't be scared, Delphine said. I'm a police officer, ma'am. I'll protect you. She leaned down and struggled with her belt, then walked around the room, mimicking Sheriff Hampstead's bow-legged gait. Sabrina laughed so hard she snorted. Granny reached into her handbag and pulled out a familiar pair of infrared goggles. Don't worry, I'm hurrying, she said as she put the goggles over her eyes and looked around the room, finally focusing on the floor. Aha! Children, come take a look. The girls hurried to their grandma. Delphine took the goggles and looked at the floor. That is so punk rock, she said. Eager for a turn, Sabrina snatched the goggles away from her sister and peered through the special lenses. They revealed ghostly white footprints, the last traces of the late Mr. Grumpner. Granny reached down and ran her finger across the floor, then lifted it. There was white powder on it. The plot thickens, she said, holding her chalky white finger up to Sabrina's eyes. Mr. Grumpner's feet were covered in some kind of dust. A bit of the dust floated up into Sabrina's nose, and she sneezed violently. Gesundheit, Granny said. They come from out in the hallway, Sabrina said, opening the door and following the glowing footprints. Notice anything about the steps? Her grandmother asked, following closely. They're very far apart, she said. 3 of my steps are equal to about 1 of his. That's because he's running, Granny informed her. Sabrina was impressed. Granny was a natural detective, and Sabrina wondered if she'd ever be as smart. The footprints came from the stairs to the first floor, and the girl headed in that direction, until suddenly the infrared goggles were snatched off her head. Hey, she complained as she turned on her little sister. If you want to wear them, all you had to do was ask. Granny and Delphine said nothing. They were looking at the ceiling with an odd expression. Sabrina followed their gaze, and what she saw sent a shock to her toes. Hanging upside down, above them, was a fat, frog-faced creature. Its head and feet were amphibious, with slimy, bumpy skin and puffed pouch under its lower lip, but it had arms and legs and the body of a human being. It was the creature's long, sticky green tongue that had snatched the goggles off of Sabrina's head, and now it dragged them in and out of its mouth as if it was wondering whether they might make a good snack. Eventually, it spit them out at Sabrina's feet, spraying sticky saliva all over the girl's pants. Oh, no thank you, you can keep them, wiping the goop off of her jeans. The frog monster let out an odd female giggle and puffed up its huge air sac. Sabrina had seen frogs do the same thing on TV. It was something they did when they were preparing to eat, and she suddenly had the feeling she was on the menu. Run, she cried. The Grimms and Elvis spun around and ran back down the hallway, but the monster leapt off the ceiling and landed in front of them, blocking their path. I spy with my little eye, the frog girl gurgled. Something dead. Okay, we'll continue later.